Um, we're also using the Wi-Fi, so in case anybody else has the password for this Wi-Fi, please don't use it for this session because it will slow down the connection. No? Hello, Shimon? Can you hear us?
Hello?
Great. Okay. We can't see you.
Hi. Can you see me?
Great. Yes. Excellent. So we can see you really well.
We good?
Yeah. Okay, so we're now going to start our last session, and Shimon has been watching us over the last 2 days in parts, and also, as I mentioned, we're joined by art critic and curator Murtaza Wali. They're both in Sharjah.
You can't hear?
Alright, there's like some weird beat.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, we've had some. No, no.
We can hear you. Just message him, tell him we can hear him. Tell him we can hear him though.
No.
Can you hear us?
Okay, let's try again.
It's going to be an issue.
Okay.
The sound is coming out. We turn this speaker off, basically. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. So,
yes.
Shimon
Okay.
Bazar is a writer, thinker, and cultural critic. He is co-author.
Can we hear that?
I'm introducing you. Can you hear us?
But then we won't be able to hear them at all.
Ah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he might interrupt me while I'm doing it, unknowingly. Okay.
It's too.
So, Shimon is co-author of The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, with Douglas Copeland and Hans Ulrich Obrist. Some of these notions that are presented in that book on the extreme present and ideas around the self are also part of his presentation today, which is going to basically trigger the forms of thinking and ideas that Shimon has been working or around with certain collaborators across different formats. His edited books include Translated by Cities from Zero, The World of Madeleine Friesendorp, a fascinating artist who I'm going to ask him about later, With Without, Did Someone Say Participate, and Hans Ulrich Obrist Interviews Volume 2. He is commissioner of the Global Art Forum in Dubai. which is an amazing site of sort of dispersal of certain very compelling, also it's a very compelling form of gathering, which has also commissioned a lot of practitioners across the region. So it happens every year in March around the Dubai Art Fair. Editor at large of Tank magazine and contributing editor at Bidoon magazine. He is director of the format program at AA School London and a member of Fondazione Prada's Thought Council in Milan, and also the soon to be unveiled Art Jamil's Museum Center. He's part of the curatorial council, which they will be having their first exhibition for in November this year. Shimon is also an extremely eloquent moderator, and so I'm quite nervous to be the one who's sort of his interlocutor today. So yeah, hopefully we're going to hear him smoothly from Sharjah to Calcutta today.
Well, as Natasha did very well, they give the go ahead for us to start. I'm happy to start, and as long as Josh can hear me, let's just start.
But we can hear him.
Can Josh put the presentation? Okay. So we're going to start. Okay. All right, everyone. If we could, I think we just start. Turn that. This.
Josh, can you put off the video?
Hello. Great. Hi, Calcutta. Can you hear me? Sorry, we're having some technical issues, as always. As I like to say, AI is easy, and always. I'll start with a short prelude. I'm very sorry that I'm able to come here. I'm born in Bangladesh, never really lived there. Plays a mythic role, cultural universe, but for the most part, it's a universe that I'm alien to. I was looking forward to basically. We have the.
I think just ask him to switch off the video.
Do I know that they have? We have the. I can't see.
I think just ask him. Then you yeah, we could hear him well when you did the test on the, yeah.
He's on the right slides. Hi. Hi, Natasha, can you hear me? Right. They can hear me? We'll just keep going. Just keep. Okay. All right. We're going to keep going. I'm going to pray to higher forces that this is coming through to you in Calcutta. It's a little bit disconcerting. I can't see whether the slides are in sync with me. Yeah. My whole presentation depends on being synchronized, and I can't tell. Well, no, because as long as he can see me. Okay, well, let's go. All right, Joshua, if you could pull up the presentation again, that would be great. It is a coarse scaffolding of prejudice and bias, which I'm sure everyone here and there has at some point experienced and will experience on a greater basis. As Timothy Garton Ash put it, we are living in a moment, quote, that is like 1989 in reverse, end quote. A time where, as Rana Dasgupta recently wrote here in The Guardian, many of us crave for anything other than the hateful technology of the nation state. For some, this expresses itself in a longing for lost empires. For others, they seek undiscovered forms of distributed and decent or globalization, system obsolete, and spasms of resurgent nationalism, sign of irreversible decline. Nevertheless, having said that as my prelude, I'm deeply grateful to Priyanka, Experimenter, Natasha, all for original, this technological work. Thank you very, very much. So, I am a final contribution to this year's Curators Hub program. I'm sure there's not much space in your minds left to absorb yet another presentation. What I feel I should really be doing is presenting something like history of the distracted enemy. I won't labor really most incisive expression of the contemporary moment that rather our capacity for and reflection. The distracted boyfriend meme, because I hate to talk about what I've done. It's a little bit like listening to my own voice on a recording, or indeed on a feedback on a speaker here in the room, or it's like scratching my nails on a blackboard. Instead, I for connection. This quote from the book, a number of things, shows in the French to me, says the poet is he who beneath the name the expected differences rediscovers the buried kinships between things, their scattered resemblances. Actually, this is the second part of a longer quote paragraph where the poet is actually comparing the poet to the madman. This in relation to a kind of field of signifiers, and how the madman and the poet kind of engage in these fields of signifiers. One destroys the chain connection, the other, in a sense, discovers the chain connection. So, although I've created exhibitions, I don't consider myself a curator. Insofar as being a curator means showing vigilance to what's at stake with contemporary curating via its histories, traditions. All of these things are exactly the kind of topics we discussed in these last days. Instead, I want to invoke this term, which is content. Now, content has become one of the prime resources today as we move deep into a world shaped by data capitalism, a world that is maniacally connected and always on, what Jonathan Crary referred to in this book 24/7 as, quote, the end of sleep. Right? So, of course, in a fully realized flat world, sleep becomes a space of non-productivity. So, the kind of wishful or a purely efficient flat world is that there is no sleep anymore. And this is, a very but also extremely terrible notion of transformation, divorcement from our own circadian rhythms. The rhythms are to us by the moon, the sun. So, there's too much content. There's also dwindling degrees of attention. Knowing everything turns out to be slightly. Now, this kind of paradox, which is dictated by ubiquitous digital technology, was the content of our book, The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, by co-author with Doug Flynn and Hansel Oberst and Wayne Daly. to modern conditions are not going away. Forces driving the current world will only accelerate. Now, this project, this book, came out of a session at 2012, where I of Canadian media theorist Martin McLuhan. The medium is the map came out in 1967 and came to define the electric information age. McLuhan postulated that all media are both extensions of man, and that the content of media, such as radio or television, isn't the radio program or the television program, but in fact the media itself. The content of television is television, the content of radio is radio, the content of magazine is magazine. Now, McLuhan was an extremely complex character, and also behind that, and in a sense, his enigma is actually becoming more and more rich as time goes on. And in a sense, more and more relevant, I believe, to our contemporary moment. McLuhan was James Joyce's PhD on an Elizabethan pamphleteer called Thomas Nash. He was a great figure for the LSD generation, and yet he was also a devout Catholic. And he had two daughters leading up to hyperactive mind, which is actually a biological condition normally only found in cats. McLuhan prophesied the internet, but he actually died in 1980. As such, he never got to see the texture of our world today, where media and content and selfhood interchange at dizzying rates. Our book is an attempt to upgrade Marshall McLuhan to the 21st century, where machines are increasingly talking about you behind your back. Technology often favors horrible people. So the Global Art Forum, which some of you certainly in this room will know, started in 2011 alongside Art Dubai, which is the largest global of art fairs in the Middle East. Since that moment, the Forum has tried to take the cultural temperature of our current moment in time, and so far has invited 450 of the world's most compelling minds to think out loud. We're building up a growing map of knowledge and imagination, because every place in the world is also imaginary, and every imaginary is in its own. We uncover blind spots in the past, which have been forgotten or erased from history. I've just picked out examples here in relation to this fascination of blind spots or erased moments in history. One of our editions is called Meanwhile, History. There was a fantastic paper given by Masha Kirasirova, who was teaching at NYU Abu Dhabi, on Soviet Orientalism, where she reminded us that in Edward Said's landmark book from 1978, Orientalism, the one Orientalism he apparently leaves out is Soviet Orientalism, so the specific relationship between the Russian-Soviet world and the Arab. We had a session by Michael Bassett, who's senior editor to Dune, which was called Extremely Soft Power or Trajectory to City Gulf. So they're kind of tracking the role of Sufi protagonists, particularly in Qatar and here in UAE, either cultural history or indeed in the urban planning department. And then there was a session with Shuda from RAC, Jocelyn Dakria, and Justin Stearns, looking at Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah and how that might be, again, newly relevant for our current moment of thinking about photography and identity. preferred content to pure novelty. As such, there are always overlaps or echoes between the editions. Guests often come back, building up a collective memory. These are previous 2012, we looked at the medium of media. Again, so somewhere between Marshall McLuhan, but also a year after the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring. 2013, looking at language, neologism. 2014, just 2015, philosophy. 2016, of the future, the theme from the past. 2017, on the trade, all good, also a trade of ideas. So shuffling of goods is always sort of shuffling of. And then this year, I'm Not a Robot, which looks at the perils and power of automation. So every issue, certainly from the onwards, every edition is co-directed with somebody new, somebody else that has a particular expertise on that theme. For me, this is very important because they bring a kind of world of insight, a world of fascination with them each time, and also I think a new audience that enriches the Global Art Forum each time. At the other end of the scale, detail matter a lot. Is our stage set. Every year we have these cushions made, and they relate to the theme. And in effect, they always ensure that even when the sofas are empty, there are still protagonists on the stage. Commissioning writers and artists to produce essays, music or art to be more impactful, such as pop here on the left, or photographic study of Dubai's Dragon Mart by Farah Al-Qasimi. And Dragon Mart is the largest of Chinese manufactured goods outside of China. It's just extremely beautiful kind of visual essay of these very strange interiors of Dragon Mart. We've also taken place in different countries, responding to context and audience. The next of these will happen in Singapore this coming September. Collaborate with the Art Science Museum here in another chapter of Art I'm Not a Robot. And so we're looking at the status of automation, shifting the center of gravity to Southeast Asia, to East Asia, what implications are there, who are the key protagonists there on this theme. These are the different descriptions that I've heard used to describe the Global Forum, all of which I'm, more than happy to entertain. A 4 to 5 years, pop-up university, the most intelligent chat show in the world. Surely that's open, but who knows. And then the last one, the forum gives a steep background of the Pentagon orbit, which I like more than all of them. So I tend to not like to theorize too much about what we do, rather than actually just get on and do it. But I do have to say what it is that we try to do there, or that I try to do there. It's a kind of staging of discourse, and in a sense, a live content machine. So, what it definitely isn't, the Global definitely isn't TED. I don't think I need to explain to all of you what TED is, because it's several views, a testament to just how unbelievably successful and ubiquitous TED has become as a different kind of state discourse. Perhaps that's because it's the perfect crystalline format for the transmission of ideas today. In TED, turn into meticulously stage-managed content with an obligation to be uplifting, humanistic, and entrepreneurial, which is exactly why I hate it. I've conducted very thorough scientific research, and I've calculated that there are 62 people in the world who haven't done a TED Talk yet. They're literally an extinct species. The other thing, FYI, with TED, I mean, the one thing that I think is really good and really important is that it applies to a very simple piece of neuroscience, which is that attention really maxed out at about 18 minutes. For anything after 18 minutes, you might as well not hear it. I'm probably already in that danger zone. I'm probably past that danger zone now. If you look at the history of TED, and there's a difference in TED and TED, of course, but particularly TED, you'll notice that at the beginning, nothing really goes over 18 minutes. Might go 20, but that's it. I mean, this is very astute. And I think it's one thing we should all learn and kind of care towards breadth. And that the kind of marathon format be often selfish. That's the one I will certainly give it. Okay. Samuel Beckett, in writing about James Joyce's Progress, this was back in the early, quite a long time ago, in the early 30s, in the mid-30s. So James Joyce was, he finished Ulysses a number of years ago. He was working on finishing his weight, and didn't have time for work in progress. He given some of a draft over to Sam Beckett. Beckett very incisively said in one of his many different feedbacks is that form is content and content is form. I mention this because as a way in to describe another staging of discourse that I stage each summer. The Architectural Association in London, it's called Format. It's a live magazine, shapes that discourse take. And the most recent issue just ended, literally last week or the week before, and South format, so the South, the individual is the South, the condition of data capitalism, and ubiquitous digital communication. Last year, and this was a sequel, so a bit like the Global Art Forum, the themes always relate to the ones that happened before. It's kind of ongoing research project. Last year, we were looking at power formats and whether power is becoming more or less visible than it was before. I would argue less visible, right? Like, because basically as everything turns towards data is something we can't see, becoming more invisible, right? And then if that's happening, there's power moving from and to. So, Facebook proudly likes to remind us population, 2.2 billion, is larger than any nation, any country on the planet. It's probably, China plus the Americans, right? So this is kind of interesting Canada Sutta, and this notion that what might come after state. So are these kind of digital, are these like social media communities a sort of possible form of statehood after the state? So this was power format last year. And then before that, I was looking at the couple format. The couple format being the smallest unit of collaboration, and looking at the kind of power dynamics that bring people together, which are often the things that also kind of force them to split apart later on. Last May, David Lynch and Mark Frost brought back their legendary TV show, Twin Peaks, for the third season. It was 25 years since the last installment, and the same amount of time had passed in the story. Lynch described the series as, quote, an 18-hour-long movie, and arguably it has reinvented the television format as much as it did the first time around, but now for very different reasons. Those expecting easy nostalgia were disappointed. The new story splintered across different cities and even more realities. I'm not going to go into all the details, that would be a very different talk to this one. But what I want to mention here is the texture of time that's encoded in this new Twin Peaks. In a character called Mike, our Agent Cooper, is it future, is it past? Because it's not clear which comes first and which follows. So this woman here, some of you will recognize her, some of you may not. She's the actress Catherine Coulson. She played a character called the Log Lady, which is one of the most beloved characters from the original Twin Peaks. In the later episodes, she makes a phone call to say that she's die. She's suffering from cancer, and indeed she did during the filming of the series. In fact, just a few days after this was filmed. So did four other of the actors, not to mention David Bowie, who was also meant to appear afterwards. My own father died of cancer just a couple of weeks before Twin Peaks: The Return began. The 18 accompanied me as he underwent surgery, medication, and eventually recovery. In this season of Twin Peaks, duration is often determined by the real time it takes for a cigarette to be smoked, right? So there's no cut. The scene is determined by how long it takes for that to smoke the cigarette, or indeed how long it takes for a floor to be swept, or the dirt in a bar. It isn't intended to someone just sweeping a floor for 4 minutes. It's weirdly radical. It's not the radical cinema, those of you know the cinema of Ozu, which is a kind of reference to as well. The beauty of the Twin Peaks was that it was impossible to guess which scene would lead to which scene. The logic is that between. Also, the show is filled with flip phones and smartphones, Skype and letter writing. Every mode of communication seems to exist at once, bewildered by each other, the way the future is bewildered by the past. Because of what happened in my family, the texture of time changed for me as much as it did in the characters in the show. The mortality of time, where a flat screen can transport you to otherworldly empathy. This is the office of Gordon Cole, who's the head of the FBI on the right, who's played by David Lynch. And you'll see in the background two extraordinary images that are facing each other. Here on the left, on the famous mushroom clouds, the nuclear atomic test, and on the right, the portrait, of course, of Franz Kafka. So lastly, in 8, the following happened, which may be the singularly most abstract piece of television content there's ever been. Can I make sure that we have the sound on from this speaker now, please? And if we can have the sound also on in Kolkata, that would be great. They cancel each other out, even better. Here we go. the end. Thank you very much.
Shimon, can you hear us?
Yeah. I think so. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear us?
What?
Can you hear us?
Yeah, but they can't. Yeah, you're only coming through this.
We can hear you clearly. We can hear you clearly.
It's on speaker.
Phone in your ear.
Uh,
Can you put the phone on loudspeaker?
sorry, the speaker's not working.
Wow.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear us?
Hello?
Yes, can you hear us?
So this, I can't hear it.
No.
Can you hear us now?
Uh,
Yeah, hi. Can you hear us now?
yes.
Wait.
Wait.
Yes. Super.
Okay, can you hear me from here as well?
Hi, Natasha.
Hi. Can you see us and hear us?
It's a 1 minute.
Yeah.
2 seconds.
Okay.
Hold on, I figured this out. Like a massive delay.
Okay.
Hold on.
I was wondering if we could go a little bit more into the question of AI and robotic reality, also in terms of this boundary between the person, the network, of the kind of politics of sort of getting into the beyond human in our sort of more sort of fractured moment. And the work of artists like Sofia Almeria, which
Hello?
you have engaged with in different ways. Hands are small.
No. Hello.
1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Okay, Shimon, we're on the
Yeah,
phone
hi.
now, which is great, but we're also, we can hear you in the room, so don't worry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So
Okay. And the room can hear me?
I was asking if you could elaborate a little more on your work with AI and robotic reality, and also the sort of moving between the boundary of the person and the network, and of artists that you worked with, like such as Sofia and Maria, in relation to these questions.
Sure. Well, the thing we were trying to pursue is that there's the question of automation. It's really weird feedback. Is usually met with either a kind of techno-fetishism or a sort of dread and fear. I think the reality is obviously somewhere in between. The question that we will cyborgs is obviously redundant because we've been cyborgs for a very, very long time. So, you know, in terms of artists, we had 2 sessions with different artists like Katia Novaskova, Aya Soliman, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, um, and they're all dealing with the kind of question, but also the technology and the possibilities of automated technologies in very different ways. Obviously, Lawrence is dealing with it from his kind of statistical forensic analysis. Katya is very much looking at facial recognition technologies and how mapped onto non-humans, so animals, which is a very beautiful reference to the original Blade Runner, with the owl that's actually a robotic owl. So there's this notion in the future that there are no animals, right? So we have to kind of make robotic simulations of them. But then, so Trevor Paglen, of course, has been very, very important. His essay, Invisible Images, I think is now canonical in this idea, which I suggested in relation to power, that there are more and more images being made today, but they're images made by machines. So they're images that are post-optical, that even if we saw them, we wouldn't know what we're looking at anymore. So Trevor's work and his now as artist president at the AI Now Institute in New York, for me, is like really, really important, because I think one of the things that I would claim is that we need, we need artists, we need writers, we need filmmakers to tackle these things, because if we leave them up to the technologists, we know what their narrative is. Their narrative is always positive. It's always utopian. But in fact, in the age of earthquakes, it's the unintended consequences of technology that make the future, right? So it's precisely what you can't plan for that is what ends up creating the future. And now we're clearly living in that right now, right? Like the decimation of consensus reality, the fact that, a bot has physical purchase than maybe you or I, etc., etc. Technologists didn't plan this. I'm not saying reality that they'd hoped for, but it's precisely in all the blind spots ends up being the future that we mostly inhabit. I think if and for me, culture at its best is able to even consider technology in a sense, like in a Duchampian way, which just you look at for not how it was intended to be used, and through the misuse of it, you understand something about what we could call the technological unconscious.
Okay, I'm going to now have a go at asking two questions, and then in case Mirza also wants to interject, that's also welcome. So the first is, I wanted to get into also your writing and the way you worked with also figures like Madeleine Friesendorp, who's such an exceptional figure, but has also sort of been marginalized. Very few people know her as one of the co-founders of OMA in the early 70s. And I wanted to just sort of think alongside you in terms of how you worked with figures like her. And the second question is, once I recall you were reading, we met up and you were reading the book Tell Them I Said No by Martin Herbert. And we had this sort of conversation around also the problematics of the professionalized art world being sort of revolved on being present. Of course, here we're missing your presence a lot. But the question of being present and what that means, the kind of pressures it puts on artists in particular, and how that can also be a question where the professionalization is perhaps not as conducive for artists as it is for curators. So the importance of saying no, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe I'll ask the turn answers backwards. I think obviously, Martin Herbert sort of postulates notion that one of the logic or pressures, certainly of a kind of neoliberalized art market, is constant presence, and of course, constant presence would include like constant social media presence, constantly appearing on eFlux, constantly being seen at the right openings, etc., etc. And as we know, visibility is obviously a very key mechanism, through which power and influence kind of lubricates itself. But I think we, maybe in a sense, those figures that somehow choose to bypass that. And here I'm thinking of everyone, Lady Salinger, to some extent Don DeLillo, Elena Ferrante, of course. I've been listening to a really great documentary on Nick Drake. Basically only gave an interview in his whole life. There's something obviously old-fashioned about that, like basically saying it's my work that matters and not me. And of course, I happily admit that in many cases, me is the work, right? So I'm not discounting formative practices, dressing up in a certain way and appearing in a certain way is what you do. But I coined a acronym a few years ago called JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. That was like my sequel to FOMO, because of course, like FOMO is, FOMO is exacerbated by this kind of constant thing. The fact that we're made to look at people elsewhere having a time than we're having, that then induces a certain anxiety. But I actually think that there's a real joy in sort of reveling in the fact that we're not somewhere. And so, I think apply JOMO to, your practice, whatever you do, and, make calibrated choices, I guess. I think when you're young, you say yes to everything, and there's a reason for that, because, you don't know if this opportunity is going to come around again. But I think, hopefully one of the privileges of getting older and maybe becoming more successful or something is just being able to decide, right? And there's something about the kind of pornography of presence that it's the standard, it's the definition today. But I think those who choose to take some distance towards that and, in a sense, reassert what really matters, something I not only respect, but I can kind of sympathize with. Does that answer that question, Natasha?
Yes.
Hold on my phone. Okay. Do you want me to answer the first one? Murtaza? He's walking over. He's walking over. I think you're talking to him.
Natasha, you can hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I was actually struck by a couple of having this conversation, but I was a little struck by the two phrases, staging of discourse and live content machine. And then also your image of Kanye and Twitter was strike through it. Because I guess what I'm wondering about is what makes discourse staging, but it's not worth staging. And I guess it's a kind of a long-winded way of asking, between question about the distinction between objecthood and likeness in our contemporary movie. Sorry to ask. Yeah.
Can you come closer to the mic?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I basically was because of curating like what being curated has come up a couple of times over the last couple of days. I wanted to ask about basically what the difference is between curating objects and curating liveness or discourse, and whether objects are inherently easily fetishizable and hence easily reducible and easily consumable, while somehow discourse, the staging of discourse, resists that. Because my take is that in this moment of kind of like a data about content, regardless of whether it's live or static, is capitalized. And so I mean, I guess the people who engage in liveness, whether it be performance or whether it be in stagings of discourse, just to push them a little bit about thinking through this. This is kind of like anxiety around because it's considered to be static, while kind of like an embrace of liveness because it's inherently not contained or discrete in a spatial temporal sense.
Okay, I'll try and answer that. The strike through was not universal, it was specific to me. I think, I mean, I was interested in being a curator maybe 15 years ago and less interested today, but that in no means is a critique on the whole practice of curating. I mean, it's in relation to my own practice. I think if I have a discipline, it's right. I probably spend most of my time not writing, which is, the fate of probably every writer trying to write. But I think, no, I'm not making a value judgment per se. Again, it's just in relation to myself. I'm more than happy to go and see objects in galleries. But I know what you're saying, that there's obviously been, I mean, let's look at the music industry, right? The music industry is completely decimated by, first by the digitization of MP3s, then now somewhere between YouTube and Spotify, all these different things, musicians simply, it's almost impossible to make money selling records or selling your music. The only way to make music, any living or make it capitalize, is by creating the unique live event, right? So the gig is like the last salvageable way of capitalizing music today. It's like, again, it's great. Like, he was like painfully, pathologically shy, couldn't play in front of an audience. He lived with make today. Like, the only way to make money is the kind of liveness of experience. And I totally agree with you. I'm not, and then there's a way in which this is, of course, commodified. And we're seeing that also now in, within art practices, whether it's, a return to or someone like Lewis and the occasion relates somewhat to Tina Segal, and this kind of, and I think there are, of course, attempts, strategies. I know, Isabel Lewis was one of the artists I invited this time to the Global Art Forum, and we just like, again, perceptions of time, of intimacy, how it's transforming through the thing that I'm holding here in my right hand, and of course creating a very highly sort of intimate space of body, right? Smell, for example. So I just spent time with Cecil Tola, we will know, and there's this researcher expert on smell. Think about it. Smell is the one thing that still yet, and she would argue, will never be captured in the digital, right? So I'm certainly interested in things that can't be captured. and interesting things that can't be captured by a picture, by a camera, that can then be relayed effortlessly, right, to all of us, and somehow that stands in for a so-called quote-unquote experience. So I worked with Pamela Rosenkrantz at the Fondazione Prada last year, and one of the key elements was creating a kind of fragrance. And this was very important because the fragrance can't be captured on camera. It can't be captured on the website. It's something you had to go and experience. And specifically, it was made from a specific kind of pheromone that only 30% of people in the world have. So you have a violent reaction against it, or you love it. And it's actually used in Chanel No. 5 and CK1. So this was a really important part of the production of this project. So yes, I mean, to some extent, I mean, it's not something, I mean, sometimes it's conscious, but it is certainly unconscious that, you know, one of these can't be captured by the camera. Last thing I would add here is I found myself, I was at LACMA a couple of years ago, incredible comprehensive exhibition on expressionism. You know, Van Gogh and that. I literally found myself moving through at the pace I would swipe on Google Images. It was exactly the same rate. And at that point, I realized that that mode of perception, that mode of content consumption had, you know, gone from the screen into my body. And this wasn't necessarily because, you know, there was degrees of detail and texture, right, in these paintings that was absolutely extraordinary, that I'd never seen before. But I was registering them as JPEGs or GIFs, and I was moving through them at that speed, you know? And so again, this is an unintended consequence of technology, right? And yeah, I'm sort of interested, again, in things that are that codifying that.
We can take questions from the audience now, but we have very little time, so we'll possibly take one or two and then move into the panel discussion.
And so if somebody wants to ask anything, they sort of actually have to go towards Priyanka, or she's going to repeat it.
If it's a long question.
That's also fine, yeah.
Are there any questions?
There might be some questions here.
Yes, if there are. If there are any questions in Sharjah in the audience?
Who are you?
Hold on.
I'm sure Umar wants to ask something.
Well, I have another question too.
Okay, Umar Singh Shah.
So my other question for you is, global art forum. I never had the opportunity to experience format, but the global art forum happens within a very specific context. So both a cultural context and then also an art world or institution context. And so what I guess I want to ask you is how you approach or how you think about that context when you program the event. Like, and I've seen a lot of the global art forums, so I kind of know this answer, but I kind of wanted to ask you, like, get some insight into your brain as to produce content that makes sense within the local cultural context, how the context of the art market that surrounds the global art forum tent, how that affects what you think others are, who you invite, who you ask them to engage with the idea.
That we're in an art fair, not of prime concern to me, and I've been given the power and privilege to do so, which is quite extraordinary, right? Like, and in a sense, but I think that did relate to the broader context. And so, you know, certainly when I got involved, you know, maybe 10 years ago, this kind of event was not something that existed here at the UAE. And you know, I think like many protagonists, whether they're people that set up galleries like Uma or Sunny and Claudia, or whether they're people that set up movie nights, or, you know, they're addressing, I think, a particular cultural landscape where some things had not happened in a certain way. And that's very exciting because it gives you the opportunity to bring something new. And I think certainly 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I hope what the Global Art Forum was bringing, which is a sort of, you know, a series of debates and discussions that cut across disciplines. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? So, and it's as simple as saying, you know, for us to really understand something like art, we have to understand everything else, the context and vice versa. So, you know, at that point, I think there was a very interesting kind of landscape where we could introduce these formats and for it to find new audiences. And I think thereon we followed two kind of logics. One is to maintain that kind of polydisciplinary kind of like fascination, of which art is not given any priority. It's just one amongst many. And if anything, sometimes, you know, I would actively play it down. And then the other is the question of geography, of where we are. And so, you know, one of the sessions we had a few years ago was called MENA. You might think that's Middle East, North Africa. We actually decided it was Middle East nervous anxiety because, you know, when people talk about the region, you never really know what they're talking about. And I'm sure this is, you know, true of South Asia as well, right? So you're talking about, you know, the Emirates, you're talking about nation states, the Gulf, the Middle East, North Africa, the Arab world, you know, like constant. And without a doubt, there'll be someone in the audience that will call you up on it, you know. So, but instead of seeing that as an anxiety, I think you see it as actually really interesting, productive, not to start thinking through questions of geography. So that's why I mentioned the Soviet Orientalism one. I mean, it's really one of my favorite sessions because, you know, suddenly to think about the Arab world, but from the Soviet perspective, like changes everything, right? So, so that's the other thing that I think we've tried to pay attention to. That there's content that has direct relevance to an audience that is from here, but then we'll have indirect relevance to everyone beyond, and vice versa, right? So I think both of these axes are kind of Catholic, which to suggest, you know, it's always part of a kind of multiplicity. And instead of having anxiety about that, you kind of harness that as a productive force, I think. Okay?
We'll continue with the
Thank you. We will continue in 10 minutes from now. We will all regroup and maybe you can continue on the Skype. Just take a 10-minute break maybe, and then we start the panel discussion. Yeah?
Okay.
The group discussion.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
We'll take a we'll take a 10-minute break.
And as I had shared earlier, it would be great if there are questions in the room, also from previous sessions, also for those who we haven't been able to take up. This is really the time. So I'm going to make a start, and I have some questions that I also couldn't ask due to shortage of time, and or things that have been provoked, as a sort of after this 3-day intensive time we spent together. So questions that came as sort of afterthoughts. So I was thinking in relation to sort of starting with the first day, starting with Sabi and Erin in particular, of how, in a sense, the space of exhibition making also performs as language. And when you talk about exhibition histories, and there are such diverse ways to map exhibition histories in our part of the world, where even certain vocabularies do not hold. And Leoli and you, Erin, especially, have revealed very concretely how your starting points differ, and how certain terminologies are translated and come to sort of stand in for strategies of display that are culturally specific. And yet, with Sabi, the sort of archival imperative, in a sense, of looking also at exhibition histories being performed through the ways that artists document exhibitions. So this is sort of a way of bridging all of your sort of different positions around this question.
Sort of, hello? Hello? Am I audible? So if I understand you correctly, basically, what are the semantics of exhibition making one deploys or rewrites, is it? Is
also
that
in the ways that artists document exhibitions, and then those become the lens through which you sort of also map and access. Also the ways that artists document exhibitions, and
Yes.
often even the catalogs have gone missing, and
Yes.
y'all have sort of restaged that exhibition in fragments.
Yes.
And that also becomes the way that those exhibitions get taught pedagogically.
Yes.
So I'm sort of wondering if you could give us certain examples or ways of thinking around this, because it is a fragmented way of approaching exhibition history, which is actually really becoming an important kind of sort of a subtopic or subject through which is becoming even more compelling than sort of curatorial studies in certain parts of the world, at least.
Sure. So, I don't know if you remember Matrix or any movies centered around teleportation. Basically what's going on is that we're a unit, and then suddenly we disperse, and then they sort of pixelate and they're all over, through either deep channels or through underwater cables or something, and then they reconstitute. That dispersion of everything has to reconstitute somewhere else into becoming the same unit. Obviously that's not going to happen because there's always a data loss and things like that, and when it reconstitutes, what if there's buffer? What if in our reconstitution, in our teleportation, there's that little ball going round and round and round, and pieces are still coming together in a pixelated manner on a screen? I think a lot of the archival work and its sort of presentation is that kind of a process where these kind of reconstitutions happen. Now, sort of complicate this one more layer. What if there's a cross connection and someone else's information is also sort of mixing up, and then you start having something like, well, maybe like the end of Terminator, when T-2000 is in lava. Like imagine a meltdown of Facebook. That's probably what the end of Terminator was. Hundreds of faces just coming out and melting and screaming, another face coming out of each other. So I think we're somewhere in between that. The full meltdown of information sort of coinciding with each other, and what Kavita was describing this morning of all sorts of fake things happening. And that's one end of the spectrum, and the other where you're trying to do a full proper teleportation, but there's a buffer. And so it's not fully complete and it's still sort of loading. And I think the strategies of exhibition making, retrieving the past, they're never going to be literally reconstructing things as they were. It's really the dispersion and then integrating it all over again. So I think the strategies of exhibition making is to see what kind of new unit you're going to make out of this teleportation of the past to the present, and The strategies one is exploring range everything from a very traditional type of thing of trying to restage the exhibition entirety, or at least show a lot of documentation so that cerebrally, academically, you can see what was coming together, or on the other hand, completely rewrite the script of a kind of meltdown of history, of things intersecting with each other. And we're sort of, I think, exploring our strategies in that wide spectrum, I feel. At AAA, I think we explore both, because we invite artists to do a bit of this and a bit of that. We invite curators. We ourselves are trying to explore these histories in that moment of capturing that dispersal. I think the buffer is not complete yet. I think Deleuze had a nice example, like when you think of throwing dice, and it finally lands to make the numbers whatever they are. What if you're sort of catching them at various instants of the dice in air, the different configurations they meet and make? So I think our strategies are somewhere on that entire spectrum, and we haven't at AAA, or I think even as individual researchers and things, tried to arrive at a full reconstruction. It's piecing those things together.
Is this working? Yes. Nora Taylor, she's an art historian, first of Cham culture and now a Southeast Asianist. She's at School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And she wrote in 2011 in Art Monthly, Art Monthly, I think. It's called Art Without History. Art Without, Nora Taylor wrote an article in 2001, Art Without History. And it struck me because we invited her in 2001 to be a part of the Performance Art Symposium. And the idea was that if Nora's teaching Southeast Asian art history, and she's teaching performance arts of Southeast Asia, contemporary art, what constitutes its founding, who are its people, this is an example. So, we invite her to speak on a panel to tell us what is Southeast Asian art history it doesn't include Cambodia. And then we have constituents of different performance artists who are Cambodian diaspora, who don't necessarily interact with each other and don't come from like the same origin to performance or the idea of the body in space. So then they're together and they inform her art history, and then she informs us, and then somehow we have a larger, the Southeast Asia map. So in 2001, thinking that that's the beginning of our space, and one of our projects is to, in some way, we were aware, at least I was aware, and later on others were aware of, that we are making art history in a way, because it's not written, and Kavita and I were speaking this morning in the taxi, is knowing that there's nothing written, there's very little written about most of the artists, and in fact even some of the programs, because even the archives you saw, like the Rimke being orated, this is really just one little piece of a huge archive, and it's something luckily that rhymed with the exhibition at that time. So picking up these pieces, not necessarily relying on a colonial archive, but creating like Rayam did through interview, through making, an art history. So it's funny because I think a lot of people over the years probably don't like me because I was incredibly insistent on when the work, I think I had mentioned that I wrote very closely to the artist. So I didn't necessarily, there's not flourishes of me in a lot of my texts. I mean, maybe there is, but it's not about authorship in that sense for a number of years. And so when the work also, part of my work was to extend that practice, anywhere. Whoever would support the artist without institutions at home, it means, if it's going to be like samaki, like reciprocal, mutual, beneficial collaboration, then we would kind of vet them, and then I would say, okay, you should do this. But I was so insistent on those texts or that biography being extended, and that's not easy because then, curators are authors, and then they want to have inflections of their voices, and in their show, and then appropriate the work into their vision, but then that extends very far from its origins, but its origins were just that year in another context. So then you just see the thickness of art history and its density in a very short moment to be transposed into something else. And artists, now English, almost everybody is fluent in English. At that time, it's 7 years ago, it was very different. Not all the artists were speaking English. So now they have more agency in, saying, yes, that's okay, I'm interested in where you want to bring my work, and totally recontextualize it. Or no, I want to keep it where it is. I want to keep it where it's from, and I want to keep my voice here. So, yeah, and I was really hyper about documenting, because if we look back, I'm just looking at, like from 1980s into today, I couldn't find images. It's very hard. There were not a lot of catalogs made. But what was made, I thought, okay, maybe I can find it through the few institutions. Rayum has a very huge archive, and I understand that Darwood is, until there's a lot of resources available, it's just impossible to dedicate your time and to have a team. So he's holding off on that right now. But there's this archive, and then there's the French Institute, which was one of the first exhibition spaces. So I went to each institution with whom I have worked and said, okay, let's do it this way. And then for one reason or another, these archives had walked away. Literally, somebody came, it was a friend of a friend, they wanted to borrow the box or something, and they didn't come back. There was a fire, the technology is now obsolete, etc. So even from it's not about the Khmer Rouge, the subjectivity, the subjective position is not always, oh, the archive disappeared in the war or the genocide. It's also that we're not archiving in the 80s, 90s, and we weren't hyper aware of how important it is to be disseminating these images, and that gets you somewhere, etc. So, yeah, so we documented well and got better and better, trained a team who knows how to document work or installations, because I was very aware that that's the only way that people would see the work in that case, because very few people, even in the region, now people are traveling a little bit more to see work in Cambodia, but not really. Yeah. So it kind of touches on, yeah.
Dipesh, I was also sort of thinking about models like Sarai, which sort of still continue to inform potential models of gathering and what we're calling sort of interdisciplinary practice, to whatever extent it authentically is that or not. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you have an answer, but I'm just thinking of how to assemble really in that way, where there is this sort of collectivity and conviviality. At the same time, there is a generative thinking around technology. At the same time, there is a way of being in and out of sync with what is happening in the cityscape. And at the same time, perhaps also tapping into some of these more sort of minor spaces and tellings. I'm not sure how could that potentially happen again? And also, how do you continue conversations with the collaborators of different generations that you all did kind of bring together at different points in that history?
Sarai is a peculiar. Today only, I was standing outside. Somebody reminded me. Nandita, she is here, right? She was a 2006 Sarai Fellow. I'm not joking. I met people. I've been to many parts of the world and I met someone Sarai Fellow, doing some research, some PhD, something. And the recent last 3-4 years, 2-3 very big books in American PhD has been Sarai Fellows. So in a very interesting sense, I think it's a diaspora. That's right. But for us, Sarai was an adventure. It was an accident that happened. It just stopped at the correct time. We wounded up very nicely because otherwise we got battered. But I think the Sarai's biggest, I think the challenge, or interesting challenge, which I think has been picked up by many people, is a certain kind of speculative confidence. In a sense that, I remember MoMA had sent a team in NGMA in 2003 or 4, where all the big shots, big shots of MoMA were there, like curatorial shots. And they were very, very confident. And so we were talking, and then I was making a presentation. I was much more cockier then. So So when I met cocky people, I became more cocky. So I stopped showing any art, and I said that I will talk about mobile telephony and how it's going to transform the landscape you are visiting. So if you plan to do anything here in the next after 10-15 years, because that's the lag time of a museum, you will need to have a different landscape which will be determined by mobile telephony. I remember being very the curators were very offended that this kind of strange speculative logic, and now MoMA's work is basically large amount of it is digitally working out projects. So the problem is that Sarai gave us that confidence. We could speculate very confidently. The Web 2 was speculated in if you see Sarai's distributed infrastructure that we wanted to build, that every Sarai fellow was part of a list, everybody would post their postings, everybody could comment, and then that was compiled and still online. So, and all books that Sarai produced was public, all the footage that we were producing was becoming public. So those forms were important. I think Web 2 made those forms generic. So we were irrelevant in that sense. But what was interesting that our speculations were giving rise to interesting intellectual questions and pursuits, like the Aadhaar, first lot of the Aadhaar inquiry was done by Sarai. Like from 2005 we were researching, that time it was called MNIC. I say this not as a pride, because there was 15, 20, 100 people hanging around Sarai. Every day there used to be 40, 50 people hanging, drinking tea, getting excited or not excited, falling in love, falling out of love. But the interesting thing was they were all into some kind of adventurous speculation. And that I fear get missed out in this. And we had banned the critique of neoliberalism. We banned the pet words. So there was no pet word you could use. Somebody would ask you the definition if you use any word. So there was a kind of, why are you using it, who used it, what are you quoting. So there was some kind of rigor and an adventurous tendency, which I see erupting again and again in many spaces. Like you were talking about the dancing girl, you could see Sadanand Menon's essay that was written on the dancing girl. There may be a pathetic dancing girl standing in NGMA, but the most interesting discussion on the dancing girl actually is happening now.
Yeah.
So there's a leak. I was showing you the footage of Jesse Owens running. That footage is shot by whom? Leni Riefenstahl. And do you remember any other athlete's face of 1938 Berlin Olympics? But that's the leakage. So Leni Riefenstahl shot, we condemned it, it's gone. Hitler is still there waving in that footage. But it's Jesse Owens footage. So it is owned as a Jesse Owens footage. So this turns and switches. This is what I think Sarai gave us, that. All of us in Sarai had that confidence to find that, where is that turn happening? Where is that detour? So that confidence, I think, I see in many people who passed and touched to Sarai, and also what they are doing in their own practice.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of as you said, it's a diaspora, it's very large, the numbers are huge, and you meet people. We continue to meet each other and circulate in different ways. But since you all still curate every now and then a sort of large-scale exhibition or biennale, how do you sort of, in that interim, since you all are also producing work all the time, and at times I guess there's this sort of intimacy of also having conversation amidst the three of you, which I'm sure is another kind of moment of intensity, and then of opening it up intergenerationally. I'm just trying to get a little bit more into the inside of your process.
See, I will give you a good example. There's a very good research now happening, which is a little speculative, but I love speculative, on cannabis as a medical ganja. On the medical use of cannabis, there is a very fascinating concept which is still on the threshold of borderline science, which is called entourage effect. What is an entourage effect? What is an entourage effect? That no component in nature appears in pure form. It is all in multiplication of forms. So, like there is no chlorophyll, that is, there is dust, there is this, that. And you know that 60% of the dust is human dead skin. So when you do this, a lot of it is human dead skin. So we live in that kind of world, like whatever may your caste be, you still deal with it. There's no escape. So the entourage effect says that the effect of cannabis on the human body, when it is through multiple compound effects. So, and we were doing this work in Magba. Now a show is coming up, it opens next to next month, which is called In the Open or in Stealth. It is about things that appear in the open, things that work in the stealth. So there is a team of 14 actually, young curatorial students of Magba. So they started, and they were this kind of this institutional critique, anti-authority that formed. So finally, we developed with them this project is called 21 Persona, where they rediscover the city of Barcelona and finds other narrative. So finally, they got convinced through cannabis research, because I think the effect that there is nothing will appear in pure form in your life, and you have to continuously work through the entourage movements and the combinations of effects. And this actually has to do with now we are working on we are rethinking toxicology, because I've started liking toxics. Like when you were saying that nobody's sitting because of toxic, I like that idea. But I started liking toxicity. So, and I can go into it if you want, but the thing is that, see, in this Indic civilization, there is huge problem with toxicity. Shit, dead animal, carcass, you push it out, you push the human beings who are working with it out, you're still suffering from it as a kind of a spiritual consequence of your civilizational scandal is huge still now. You're not able to even understand its implication, and your West dump, everything is a mess, because your inability to deal with toxics. And now more and more of us, friends and people around us, deals with diseases that have very high level of toxicity and management of toxicity. So it is not going to go away, and the dead skin in our skin is going to be rising rather than falling. So what we try to do in the now dialogues with the new generation of people is that the criticality is brought outward, because they come to it with a lot of critical, and there are a lot of questions here also has that, the entry point is this idea of condemning criticality. You have to condemn something to then become aware. So we try to figure out another way of entering this debate. And I think that we learned from Sarai in some way, but now between three of us, we are continuously doing that. And actually frustrating each other, because it's very weird. You suddenly come up with a completely different, you have to unpack it also, you have to read a completely new domain. But that's the fun part of it. And that's, I think, is the dialogue, because in China we had dialogue with about the whole team that worked on 51% was 10 to 15 people, all young, between the age of 20 to 26, 27 maybe. So, and in Barcelona it is between 20 to 35. So it is, but you have to be inventive to produce that dialogue continuously. There is no stability to the dialogue. If they come to the dialogue, and if we go to the dialogue that we are known, you are known, that won't work. It's that negotiated eligibility, like I will also open certain new way of thinking, you open, and then we meet somewhere, which we both don't know where. So that's the...
Thanks. Adam, I wanted to turn to you, and something we didn't get to during our session, a comparison that is sort of often just made in terms of the lineage of Documenta, sort of thinking from Catherine David's edition to Okui's, to Carolyn's, to ours, and there's always these sort of kind of vague gestures of comparison that become made externally, and that is sort of one way of telling a history. But often there are also, of course, tendencies of departing and rebelling and countering. But at the same time, I was sort of wondering in terms of the relation to Documenta 11 and the kinds of critique it faced. I've been reading some interviews with Okui, and it's sort of hilarious how some of those critiques also relate in a sense to what we did, and how there is a little bit of impatience when heavy topics are being dealt with. I mean, when he was thinking about the role of traumatic realism or documentary, and he sort of says that I wasn't interested in the short film format. I wasn't interested in the quickly looping film. I was interested in documentary, and in that sense also thinking about truth production and transitional justice. And there wasn't much patience with these forms. And I still hear people who say it was too much, and I'm still dissatisfied with that experience. And yet there's, of course, a whole range of artists who we, in fact, have also worked with, who have been informed and started sort of believing in that format with that edition. So I'm just wondering how you'd sort of respond to some of these things.
You mean the format of the long documentary?
Just also some of the strategies that were used in Documenta 11 in terms of these sort of also mapping sort of these questions in a serious way, in a significant way, and not only including certain artists through a very formal engagement with post-coloniality, but in a real way, causing a rift in that format. And I'm trying to think, would we have done this the same way as well if it had not been for certain turns that happened during that edition?
During the Documenta 11, specifically. Well, as I understand, the Documenta 11 is probably the one that got sort of nearer to India and Southeast Asia through the fact that one of the conferences or sessions took place in New Delhi, and I think that Documenta was a great opening in a sense of physically and intellectually sort of decentering the build-up of the exhibition and sort of moving a large part of research and reflection preceding the actual show, which was very much limited to all kinds of venues in Kassel. But the preceding phase, the build-up phase, was played out elsewhere. And this elsewhere was chosen for various historical, cultural, and symbolic reasons as well, including an island, for instance. So suddenly, I think this Documenta allowed the audiences and the thinkers and others in Europe to understand that knowledge does not belong to them, that is produced elsewhere. And this is actually the knowledge from which to quickly try to learn now. And I think that this is a lasting, let's say, heritage and a kind of resource on which any other attempt to build a meaningful exhibition with an ambition to reach some sort of global dimension or dimensions has to be premised. So it is clear that repeating the scenario in which an exhibition is every 5 years realized in the city of Kassel and sort of built looking from Kassel towards many imagined outsides, it just doesn't work. Because there are places of production, there are places where reflection is produced, which are ticking on completely different rhythm. They are kind of not very much concerned really with this sort of what we used to understand. The question is who is the we, as the mainstream discourse or canon. So I think that this canon and these discourses of the mainstream have been shaken so many times that they are newly shattered and they are newly becoming obsolete. And maybe this is the time for the last push, you know, for the kind of liberating push, or maybe just letting go of those and moving. And I'm kind of alluding to what Lily was speaking about in his talk, that we should not really be, you know, the kind of question that is being asked to indigenous artists about the relationship to kind of, how should I say, non-indigenous? And the question is, who is the non-indigenous? Is there any non-indigenous, if you look at it from the point of view of sort of looking into the indigenous practice as the generative source of any making and any thinking, bound to specific set of geographic, climatic, cultural, other circumstances. So I think that instead of, you know, being embattled in a kind of endless and irreconcilable strife with the canon, it is really time to work beyond, below, above, elsewhere, in a certain, without forgetting that this canon still has, or is still exerting quite a destructive influence. And it is also a canon that very practically defines the principle of what calls itself the art world, which is not the only world of arts, that we should understand. So instead of being endlessly involved in battling these canons, I think we should calmly work from within the context in which there is knowledge, there is people, these people are moving, communicating, and so forth. So I guess this kind of enmeshing of the canon in all these other discourses is far more productive in terms of slowly letting it rot and maybe feeding from it than, always kind of projecting it and hypostasizing it as a kind of dominant force that is one and that has to be, endlessly fought against as a sort of empire, because this empire is proving every day, reading reports in the media and listening to people's experiences, is proving itself not only inefficient, obsolete, but also extremely harmful. So I think there is no time to waste, and we should concentrate on more productive and truly creative ways of getting out of these traps of the kind of confrontation between canonical and this, what is left outside of the canon, which would be the minor histories, for instance, and also the kind of confrontation between the indigenous and non-indigenous, to the point of kind of completely dissolving the issue of the mainstream and of the canon. Yeah, but that would be my...
Great, thank you. That prompts me, Lily, if you'd be willing, one observes also, just when there is the privilege, to see how vast, I was trying to gesture that in the introduction I was making with, to your practice today, how vast the network really is of indigenous artists and activists. Often that's a sort of artist-activist, sort of not as an inseparable sort of, and I'm amazed that, sort of Outi Pieski, an incredible Sami artist in Finland, talking about sort of saving a river and how that river basically is the body that runs in parallel to so many different communities and groupings, and how that kind of political, that sort of protest, that sort of the aims of that protest and those gatherings for them are also ways of narrating, and they're not flattening, but they're actually interested in indigenous communities from different parts of the world, whether that's in New Zealand or Australia or Canada, to join in and to. So I'm just wondering if can you share some instances also where there isn't this sort of very banal sort of, okay, this is now protest and that is art. I'm just wondering. Yeah.
Thank you. I would just highlight Marit Anne Sara's work, Pile of Sapmi, and which was like, she can speak to that, and if you look it up, it's a really incredible project, and was acquired by the National Museum of Norway after extensive protests in front of the parliament, where the different governments, particularly in Norway, are shifting the law to disallow Sami reindeer herders from gaining a living from their ancestral practice. And I think about Arundhati Roy and the rivers and dams here. It's like long histories of dispossession that, one kind of small action can have thousands of manifestations in practice in terms of like a art installation or something like that. But the creek that runs through my family's land is not well, and I think it's a good indication that we're not well. And we talk about it like it's like just a creek, but it's named after an ancestor whose and it's named the tears of this ancestor, and it's supposed to be a place of healing. But if the river is not running well, then we're not well, right? We're not maintaining our responsibilities. So if I name an artwork or a series of artworks after that creek, it's also kind of trying to revive this memory and a responsibility. I don't know if I can really speak that much more.
Maybe you could speak about like the Indigenous Journal or like the Trans-Indigenous working together. I think she's looking for an example.
Yeah, so I mean,
or something like that.
When I was in Dhaka in February, it struck me that one of my mentors from Canada, from the Métis Nation, David Bagarno, was part of the group, Sovereign Words, and that I'd like rely so much on his writing and from his specific territory and experiences of Canadian settler colonialism to kind of understand how Australia works, and then the fragmentation of my homeland and into an American territory and some supposed, British, German-inspired fake democracy with a dictator too. So, but then the people from Sápmi were reading the same texts. Of course, we're mostly reading English, which is a big problem. And so when there were Santal people in the room, they had an interpreter from Bangla. So it's going like 3 ways. And if it was Sami people speaking, it's going 4 ways, because they're maybe expressing themselves in Norwegian. So it's the problems of translation are also opportunities to meet. And I think particularly the Santal community in northern Bangladesh are experiencing a lot of, the period of the British Raj supported, or there's those kind of era laws codified Santal presence on particular territories, and the Bangladeshi state is like annulling them. But then, this creates more displacement. And I just think these things they're not isolated, and people are very aware of each other more and more. But, and like right now in Australia, there's huge discussion around how to memorialize the frontier wars and huge genocidal campaigns. But also that violence hasn't stopped. So how do you memorialize something that isn't ended? When the police violence against Aboriginal peoples is insane. They're targeting African migrants right now. Islanders get targeted all the time. So it's like a never-ending memorial, really. And some of those, in a lot of these forums recently, are for the family, the descendants of survivors from a massacre site. And others are some kind of public exutoire, something for people to come to. But the rivers are still, like some of them in the middle of Melbourne, for example, are like, the river is covered up by the tram line and the road. So like literally when you bring that back out, maybe we'll find out who we are.
Overall and Kavita, I was just trying to ask a sort of a common question, but please feel free to sort of go your own way with it. Thinking about our different contexts, sort of just for now bracketing you as sort of the context in Istanbul, yes, to just the fact of like an example such as a Yama screen and what it actually meant for the scene there. And at a moment of its closure, I'm trying to think, how do you then reimagine another tool, even if it's not this sort of large public screen in the center of the city that's disseminating this sort of project? Because as we sort of experienced, whether it's in India or in Istanbul, we've talked about other places in the world, there is this, the timing of the shutdown is becoming so quick that the minute there is a sort of a mobility of influence and information and exchange, especially when that is somehow disseminating on the sort of social interfaces, or has sort of an international, like the critical article and somebody reads it. It's sort of, you never know when you're sort of shut down or through sort of trolling and all of this. And Kavita, I was also thinking of just reading from afar about how this SAA students at a certain point were holding like a sort of a conference outside. It's the place where, on the steps, really outside, in the kind of courtyard area where we used to sit when we were waiting for class to begin. And they were sort of self-organizing, really, to see what was still possible outside the classroom, but like immediately outside the classroom. So it also forms this kind of space to still be present, and yet somehow deliberate and have some sort of exchange. I'm just wondering, as this negotiation is getting so much more precarious, how can we still be present with our work and our thoughts?
How to start? How do you prefer? Right.
Just take it close.
All right. Oh, that's close. Okay. So, I mean, already when I took over Yama project, I mean, Yama has been going on for quite some time, on and off. Different curators and different artists have been engaged with it since 2005. And it's sort of, it is interesting now that it's a black screen, really like a kind of a tombstone on the top of this hotel, is like kind of for me a mark of that scene, that the high time of the Istanbul art scene, when everything was flourishing and open and there were so many different conversations and it was very fluid. And Yama was really part of it. I mean, Silvia Kuvali initiated Yama for that reason. And it was really like, I don't know, at that time, for example, like the videos of Claire Fontaine were like remade to fit the screen, and it was very simple and like very operative. Or Wael Shavkes Al-Aqsa, for example, kind of turned in also as part of the Yama project. So when Yama, as a proposal, like came to me, all of us like engaged with the project, felt the re-emergence of the public discourse in Istanbul, especially after Gezi uprisings, and how it is important actually to really claim that space, continuing using that space, like those publics, because of course some sort of Damocles sword was kind of hanging in the air. Everybody was feeling it, but at the same time, it was a real necessity to point that out. And the second thing was, of course, that when Yama started, Istanbul was much more precarious and more anarchic as a scene. And by the time I took over, it was really like a more corporate scene. A lot of big families investing in contemporary art, and really not having those small spaces, but really these big monies, big chunks of monies having the big spaces. I mean, we always discuss how SALT is very different from platform Garanti, for example, in our formation also. Also, what happened to Istanbul Biennial in the meantime? What was Istanbul Biennial in 2005, and what became of Istanbul Biennial in 2015? These are all these kind of examples that are there. So already, long story short, like when I took over Yama, I really wanted to make this kind of proposal of a new sort of contemporary art center that can operate, that can again, open dialogue with other scenes, with minor histories, with things that are happening like around the region in a different way, because of course when the structures become corporate, those channels of communication get, de facto blocked. That's how it happens. So of course, how it happened, like how the closure happened, is I think also kind of another sign of that, like how that discourse, how to point that out was important. And after the closure happened because, just to say, the municipality told us that it's not possible to hold these screens in a particular altitude anymore, but everywhere was full with private screens showing really like, advertisements and all this stuff. So it was obviously not about that, and there's always this mechanism of Turkish state kind of operates like through that, like they never give you the direct reason, so you cannot really fight with them because there's always this kind of indirect way of like operation, like to shut things down. So it's not only, of course, about Yama, it's about the film scene, it's about like the experimental theater, it's about, it's about many things. So it's a kind of a full discourse, like a full thing that is in operation. Right now, I would say, this is a kind of a long political discussion, but I try to keep it short. Right now, with the new election, with the confirmation of the new presidential regime, it was not very surprising that the new arts and culture law is getting in motion. And one of the first things that was done was to get the operation of state theater and opera. And all the ownership of state and opera is passing to presidency. And they are basically locking that down slowly, like bit by bit. And this law, this is in motion. This will also slowly, bit by bit, will make its way towards us. And we really need to talk about in Turkey how we deal with it, inside and outside. Now there's a kind of de facto diaspora happening, especially in Berlin, and in the bonds that staying in Istanbul, and how will we sort this thing out? Because self-censorship, of course, in this kind of environment becomes an important issue that we need to confront and to really settle down to make a more, I would say, decisive moves to really open up breathing spaces in the art scene in Istanbul right now. So I hope.
Yeah, well, this note of self-censorship is actually an interesting thing for me to start trying to answer your question, Natasha, because we are in a very uncomfortable place right now, where you have to go to certain pockets of the country to be able to say certain things or to be able to eat certain things. And we are becoming increasingly aware of how precarious our, I don't even want to call it liberties, but how precariously poised we are with regard to our rights. But Erin's talk again, kind of affected me a lot, because I think of Southeast Asia and, as a place of a certain culture, certain tourist enticements. But of course, you remind us that it is also a place of dictatorships, all the nations are dictatorships. And I feel that actually, we have some things to our west, we have some things to our east, and what we think we have right now is actually anomalous. And it's the normal which is creeping up on us from both sides. And pretty soon, it's going to occupy this space as well, and maybe we have to start girding our loins for that, And it's a very, very frightening thought, because right now we are at a state, what you were just speaking about the takeover, Erdogan's takeover of the opera and of the theater. That is a statal kind of a shutdown, right? Before that comes, there is an atmosphere of fear which causes us to do self-censorship, right? Right now we are in a phase which is actually a little bit before that, and however vexed and difficult it might seem, it is still a space of freedom, because if we think about the vicious online atmosphere and the trolling that we have, which is so current in India, I don't know how many of you are aware of how vitiated the social media space is. But when you had things like that campaign against Padmavati, the film, right, which was just absolutely insane campaign that you had, or so many other debates that are erupting on Twitter every day, or in an earlier era when internet was still new in the country, the kind of targeting of Hussein that was done through online platforms, right? All of those actually depend on the targeted item or person or phenomenon being super famous. Because your trolling becomes something important and a matter of national debate and something that can polarize a lot of people only if you are targeting something that is really, really prominent and significant and influential in some way. So in a way, the state that we're in, even the trolling is sort of guaranteeing that that thing that is trolled has to remain prominent, right? But I do think this is a kind of an interstitial phase, and we are going to move towards, you know, the boot on our heads, a more forceful regime of control and shutdown. And then, you know, what is going to happen to us? Are we all going to be celebrating ourselves as versions of Iranian filmmakers who have these very reckoned kind of articulation, that you know, you're able to speak in riddles, and we're supposed to be happy that we can speak in riddles? Is that our future forever? Maybe.
Yeah, that's a big question.
And I just wanted to add that since 1979, the center of Iranian visual culture and music is in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Where there's 4 television channels that broadcast in Persian language globally, because women can't be on television, and you know, like it's. Of course, it doesn't change how people could feel it in Iran, but you can kind of displace or defer the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I somehow find the beauty of Iranian cinema, you know, coming from Iran, very disturbing, because it seems to have provided us a solution for how to live with dictatorship and with the inability to articulate, and it presents it actually as an aesthetic possibility, which it should not be.
I think I live in a place where it's it is the only possibility. I mean, I don't know, the point, like when I go, I'm about to live in the US again after 17 years, I find it extremely abrasive, because you have all of that potential to say exactly what you want. And for me, the poetics are gone, and the language, the artistic language is gone somehow. But that's because I've been in a context in which not just the country, but the whole region is speaking like Iranian cinema, similar to Iranian cinema. And I became, you know, coming from what I now find quite abrasive, I appreciate this. I've learned from this, and I've learned that not everything can be, or not everything should be clear and passed, just handed over. Give me your opinion, give me your knowledge. But, you know, going back to art history, I believe, actually I just spoke with your mother, with Natasha's mother, about, you know, we can water, I chose the card, we can water the farm, we can water the land 100 times, but there's, it chooses its own moment to come up. And this is, I have this deep belief in art history. So this Twitter, I stay away in a way because it occupies too much. I think it's not poetic, it's not the space, you know. But I do believe that even, you know, that somehow I start to really believe in art history, that when whatever's written, that I can go to that place, you know, my daughter can go to that place if she so chooses. That it's not, let's say if we think about Adam, it's not a colonial archive anymore that she can draw from. She can draw from maybe some of these voices. And that will be her time, or that 100 years later that she... I chose the patience card, so I'm just putting that out there. Which is not about this, you know, I mean, not that I don't find things urgent. I mean, the people I work with in my work is somehow, yeah, we believe in an urgency, but then there's just, we live in a place that's so out of our control, and any step forward that is articulate will put you in prison, or will, you know, so you can't function from there either. So, or some artists have, you know, but yeah.
I have just one question before opening up to you all. Thank you for being patient. And I just wanted to also go back to certain points that were made during or in the after Prasad and Rupali's presentation. And I was just wondering of how much of the research on sort of the question of like the kind of shifts and the sort of these sort of transactional kind of spaces, and sort of also this sort of jugaad and all of these techniques, you know, how much of that also obviously kind of comes from the rural and sort of migrates into the urban. I know there isn't this kind of neat line, because of course you started your presentation with, you know, how cities are formed and the number of them and the official number of cities and the kind of unofficial. But still, I'm just really trying to think about that. I mean, just also to just mention, like, I started by studying journalism, and one of our teachers was P. Sainath. And when I think about the People's Archive of Rural India, I'm just also thinking about how the documenting of those, you know, sort of forms, they're actually, they're present, and they have their own lines of entering and leaving the cities. Yeah, how much time do you sort of spend also thinking about those sort of practices?
I can probably give an example. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So there's some of our students were studying this tribal village, which is about 2 hours from Mumbai, and in some ways, what it did was it kind of opened up, you know, this whole, I mean, instead of the anthropological gaze outwards, it's almost kind of turned in on oneself, and, you know, you suddenly started, you know, thinking about your own ideas of how, for example, you thought of the idea of the home, you know. So there's the practice of building houses in this village is kind of the cyclical process that it's made out of wattle and daub, which kind of it's perishable, you know. Every 2 years it disintegrates, and so you have to go back and make that house every 2 years. And it's just this whole rhythm, you know. It's like when it's not the agricultural season, then you go and make the home. There are other times when you migrate back into the city, and people are actually living on the streets at this time. So it's kind of this process that is going on. But when the government sees this whole, the state sees this idea of home, it's seen as temporary and so kacha, you know, and that's not something that gets funding, you know. But then the community is also quite clever about this, and what they do is they use the fund. They'll make a little concrete house because that's what gets the fund, but then use it to repair, you know, this present house. So in some ways, it's, you know, there's a kind of practice which is inherent in the way. I mean, if you look at it as a binary, it's like, oh, the state is still. But, you know, people now have agencies themselves, and, you know, their practices change when things like that happen. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at that practice slightly closely.
I just want to kind of distance myself from the term jugaad, because it has kind of, you know, very, I mean, because you know. I mean, if the question, if your reference was, you know, I mean, the difference between the urban and the rural, which we don't make at all, actually. But if it is about the kind of formality of life, suppose if it is, then, you know, I would argue that in extreme formal conditions, you know, I worked at the state for 10 years. So in those extreme formal conditions, you see, you know, many kind of mobilizations that happen, which are not necessarily, you know, we cannot kind of, you know, we cannot kind of, you know, identify it as a clear process, you know, of things, because there is so much negotiation that takes place even from within the state. We know that, you know, people outside the state kind of negotiate, but even from within the state, like for example, I'll give you a, you know, the chief of resettlement and rehabilitation is a very close friend, and in the Mumbai metropolitan region. And you know, so he's kind of trying to kind of shift a woman from a house, you know, and it's basically a family. Now they have this husband and wife have separated, so he's trying to kind of, you know, shift them to another place, another house, and then they've separated, they live in the same house, but they don't kind of, they don't behave as husband and wife. So then they demand for 2 houses. And then they say, but this guy has this problem, you have not legally separated. How do I give you 2 houses? Then they say, you want us to live together? And then he says, no, you don't live together. Why don't you kind of, but for me to kind of give you 2 houses, you need to be at least divorced, or at least file. He said, you want us to be divorced? And there is where the negotiation starts from this guy who's trying to kind of, work this out, and he works out a very interesting, case, creates another family within that family and then gives them 2 houses and all of those things. So, but there is always this encounter from whichever place you kind of see the, where you engage with the city. So it's kind of this. It's not every day. It's kind of it works through and through actually.
Just so you know, Shimon has been on the whole time, but
Okay.
we can open it up.
So we're also going to take questions from Sharjah, from Shimon and Murtaza and other members of the audience there. So we'll stay alert for that. Is there anything already?
There is something already, and they're saying they're watching us to today, but call when we're ready.
No, it's fine. If there's a question, then you ask.
Okay, if there is a question, let us know and we can sort of read that out to the audience. And okay, is there anything from you all that we can start with?
Hi, Kavita. I'm Rajashri. I had a question. You showed us the photograph of the carpenter manhandling the cloth. Could you tell us what transpired from that? Because I guess, I don't know, there was time to take a photograph of it, but was there an explanation given to the carpenter about what is the significance of this museum object, or was he fired, or because I guess museums are heralded to be these public spaces for everyone. So the carpenter occupies the space of a worker, but also potential audience member. So as much as bureaucracy and red tapeism is involved, where do we hold our individual responsibility and our privilege, and how do we push that power to speak to people about our work?
That photograph was not taken during installation.
Okay.
The photograph that I showed you, where I was able to show you the upper red edge of the textile, was taken in the storage area when the keeper was showing the textile and saying this is a possible inclusion for the show. So it was her assistant who was holding it up.
Yeah.
And the problem, that I witnessed, which upset me, was during installation when there was no keeper and no other staff from the museum in the room. The carpenter is a permanent employee of the museum, and he is supposed to have some sort of rudimentary training in object handling, which is it's a very, very important part of having trained professionals in a museum, because the museum makes a commitment to preserving its collections for the unknowable future. So
as professional heritage.
Yeah, as professional heritage lovers. So I'm not sure where to go with the second part of your question. Of course, nothing happened to him. What transacted, which I described to you, was a transaction just between him and me, where I begged him not to mount the textile the way he did, but suggested an alternative. But to me, it was just horrifying that an event like that could have happened, that 2 nails could have been driven into that textile at all.
No, I get it.
To go to his senior
They weren't there. They weren't there. The exhibition opened on the 27th of January. As you may know, the 26th of January, we have the Republic Day parade. So the entire area is sanitized and sealed off for 4 days before, because the Prime Minister and the President and all are there. So we had to work like all night for several nights to get this on. And this was, you know, when we were spending a night there were no senior officials there. And no, I didn't take this up. I didn't tell anyone about it beyond the designer and I who were in the room who saw this happen.
Yeah, no, I wasn't.
But I must say that this is a routine. For example, the keeper of manuscripts used to turn the pages of manuscripts like this. It's routine.
No, I guess I'm not really talking about specific instances like that. I mean, I guess because I think it's happened in so many of our lives where we encounter positions of power, like maybe setting up for a gallery and things like that. So how do we engage empathetically and also like kindly and smartly with everybody rather than, I guess, in a commercial gallery, you're looking for a different audience, but in a museum, like the dream is that everybody can access it and everybody can.
Inclusive space, and it's a public space, and it's open to everybody.
So then the workers also become audience, or
not at the moment that they are.
Yeah, of course.
Mounting. Yeah.
Yeah.
The object.
Yeah, it's
just like below zero. Also, like you were a contracted independent curator. You're not in the institution with the weight of the institutional backing to change the practices and make sure that that person gets the professional development training, of course, you know?
But I guess it's a question about power, right? It's a question about being
I think.
Well, I just wonder why, given the sort of premier position of both the National Museum and JNU within a short space of each other in the capital, why there's absolutely no interaction between you.
Sorry? No interaction between
Why there's no interaction between JNU and
I
the
think they've
National.
had quite enough of us. They've had Naman and they've had me in their galleries. That's a fair amount of interaction. We have a couple of students who are employed there. There is some amount of interaction. I wouldn't say that there's.
Oh, sorry, I thought at the end of your talk, I thought you said there wasn't any interaction.
No, that's another institute we were talking about.
Okay.
An Institute of Art History run by the National Museum.
Within.
So the irony, which the questioner rightly tapped into, is the fact that in a city like Delhi, there are basically two institutions that are running postgraduate programs in art history, and the two institutions don't really collaborate or talk to each other. We don't have joint conferences. We don't send our students to each other's courses. We both act as though the other doesn't exist. And it's because we are both teaching two very different kinds of art history.
Right.
And so actually we cannot exist in the same room. You know, it's like matter and antimatter.
I think my question is also for Kavita, and it was something that I wanted to ask before. Well, it actually draws on what you just said. So I've seen this model before of the museum you describe, and it's a very familiar model for me. And we're sort of kind of keep going in circles about sort of reveling in these details. I wanted to ask a question from sort of a position of empathy. If I empathize with the collection keepers for a moment, and I think about what is it? It's a generational fear, it's a generational apathy, it's a generational paralysis. And my question goes back to what you said already, is who taught them? And who's teaching the next generation? And why can't we include antimatter, which you just called it as a matter? Right. Why, I think there's kind of this big discussion going on about, against. Yeah. I mean, antimatter has to be within. And going back to the comment of the saliva that you just made, I've actually spoken to a restorer recently, and she used her own saliva to restore Russian icons because apparently it's the best solution to restore. And she's very proud that her DNA is on these very important icons. Just a small comment.
Surely what your saliva is contributing depends very much on lunch. For all time, so maybe your saliva is better than my saliva. I wouldn't want to school on any of the paintings in the National Museum, even if it's good for them. So I retain a criticism about that. But so I'm not sure I completely understand the reason why we are at this generational point that we are at. But if I look at what was happening in the museum world in India in the 1970s, it seems to have been a very lively place. And there seems to have been a good deal of energy, a good deal of good fellowship, and a good deal of optimism, scholarship being produced, active collecting happening. But in many of the instances that I have looked at, I can't say I've looked at a very broad range of institutions, but in many of the institutions that I have looked at, it is people who are on the governing council or the board of trustees, who are people who are actually outside the museum profession, who are the guys who are schmoozing with the rich collectors, getting the collections in, writing the books about them. These are people with tremendous social capital. They are diplomats, they are lawyers, very famous lawyers, they are captains of industry. And they function within the museum world on a kind of an Uber level. And the functionaries who work in the museum either were chosen by these people just to be assistants, or were not, given any opportunity. And so when that generation of the museum founders actually died out, there were some relatively mediocre, meek people without initiative over there who, in order to maintain their position as bosses, had to choose a generation of people who were meeker and less able than themselves. So it's just sort of gone on.
Could I give an example?
Yeah.
This comes up in my mind. I don't know how it's going to sound. I have had to train without much training myself. I worked in museums before I did the work I do. But it means training, a number of different team members, from documentation to handling. I was just telling somebody I have to step out of the room because shipping is like surgical, and I get really stressed about it. But somehow I trained that even though it's not my expertise. And I think about some sensibilities, like some people we just could not keep because the sensibility was not to care, not to, just in their own way, whether it's their belt or the artist's work, it's, there's not a sensibility there. But in another sense, I mean, it must be particularly to their, to their lives. So in particular context where I am, there is not a lot of things from the past. So there is not, I wonder what his particular story is, that there is not a particular value in objects, So there's an experience behind that. And I was thinking about Van Mollivan, an urbanist, architect, hydrologist, who recently passed away, but he was really the father of new Khmer architecture, modern Khmer architectural movement, and the former head of state. And I had a chance to be with him on a number of occasions, and I remember asking him, what do you think about, first, the destruction, because many of the buildings are already gone, and it's gone from a very recent generation, this particular, like in the last 10 years. So there's an answer to this, but I was more provoked by his answer to, what do you think about this government ruining your buildings by renovation? So the renovation is like awful new tiles, or like brick facades that are painted red with white instead of leaving the brick, and things that are so devastating somehow. And I was expecting, I could never expect him to say, I'm very pleased that they care about my buildings. I am so pleased that these buildings matter enough to them today to take care of them with what seems beautiful today. Yeah. And this is difficult, but it's so beautiful. I learned so much from this. So I could then appreciate, some buildings I couldn't even go to anymore because I was so frustrated. And then I came back with a very different attitude, because the maker of those works 40 years ago, he understands that there's antimatter, and that we have to live with it.
So we should be happy with the way this museum.
Well, it's not. I'm not happy, but he's also defeated. This is another thing. I'm not idealistic. He's very defeated, and this is his way of coming, to terms with what's happening. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Shilpi. So it's very interesting to be part of this insightful discussion, and it's interesting to talk. I mean, I heard so much discussion about larger scale Biennale, organizing larger scale Biennale, and inside the display about art practice. But I was also curious, if any one of you, like maybe Natasha or then Erin, can little bit reflect upon the crisis of being outside the structure, because everything has been talked about. It was completely falling in the structure or within the institution. And then Erin was also talking about, like, if you look at the language politics, so like she just mentioned that, okay, decades back, so English was not very popular and many artists were also not able to participate or the articulate well in a way, whether it's a curation or connecting with the artist or selection of the artist. But then how about even now, if we look at the large scale in Asian countries, and again, if we are doing it so, and the people are still comfortable, then also what kind of narrative we can bring in. So like,
can we take one more question from Sanchayan at the back, and then Malkushi?
I was thinking about because this whole issue about whether the carpenter knows how to hang up image or not. I think whether there is a certain kind of gap or certain kind of lack of institutional infrastructure or knowledge in practice, even in art colleges, art institutions, and also museum practice, that what is about making an exhibition. I think we have discussed a lot of different strategies of dispersing and kind of breakages or ruptures, or how do you engage with the idea of exhibition. But most of the institutions are more engaged in how to make art. I mean, the idea of sharing and how to disseminate or how to engage is not even in the curriculum of the practice. It's what Jivesh was talking about, this reading together, or about this, engaging together and learning together. I mean, it's a total absence of a certain methodology which is happening on a curatorial level or in the global context of hosting exhibitions. But institution, I think a lot of gaps are there of engaging with the idea of what is about exhibiting and why we are exhibiting in a certain sense. So if you could think that how a method of curation or curatorship is as a practice, curation as a practice could engage with these issues also, and not become this outsider engaging with the institute and waiting for an infrastructure to support.
Could you pass on the mic to Sharjo if you have a question?
Quickly.
I have a question as well. So thinking about the Twitter handle Real Indology, public television and popular media, a lot of newspapers, I'm realizing here, the kind of voice that they have at the moment, and the kind of stories and truth-telling that they are taking upon themselves to interpret our history, archaeology, various other aspects. What I'm wondering is that someone is doing a really good job in reaching out to an audience which is not sitting in a room like this, and involving them in discussions that happen on real Indology, for instance. So how can we then, aside from talking to a converted audience that we are at the moment, talk to people, the carpenters, the keepers, just as an example, not as a critique, but as an example and as a challenge to take on. How can we talk to people who are around us in a way which is not intended to theorize, but to share, so that they can then, they have the agency to participate on their own terms with this.
Thanks. We'll have to kind of, sorry, there's a lot of questions, so I'm not at all to sort of put pressure, but just sort of saying if you all make your questions quite short and precise, or comments as well, is very welcome, but we need to take take stock of the questions in the room, so please.
Can I come into this one?
Yeah.
Sure.
You know, like once I was talking to a railway engineer, and he says, just don't go to a yard and see the bogies of the engine. You will never be able to get into a train. And there are 14 lakh railway workers. They are working, and it is best work with 50% surety, 50% chance, and life hopefully will be with you. And I survived. But I'm just saying that, you know, the scale of the world in which you live, and you eat always in the restaurants, and if you read any blog, you are going by a trust. If you go to a kitchen, you won't be able to eat. You know, don't try to go to every kitchen. You know, Dan Graham said a very nice thing about art fair. He said artists should not go to art fair sometimes and get very serious, because it's like seeing your parents having sex. So the reason is certain things are not, you don't spend too much, you do whatever you can do in the terms that is set for you. If you start creating that I will set up all the railway bogies, all the yards I will fix before I go to a train, you are in trouble. That chance, see, life is made of those chances. You know. There is a brilliant essay by Ian Jack on the train accident that happens in England, which changed so-called the whole train system in England. The error, the chance error was even like fraction, but that changed the whole railway structure of England. But like, this is like, how do I say it? You know, Jostling, please read Josling's book, you know, like this is famous Swedish statistician, and the chance that in one road a woman would cross and get killed, there is like 40% chance. And still all women are crossing that road. But, so there is a certain kind of statistical form by which we live and make sense of the world, continuously going. Nobody would have kid if the labor pain and the maternity mortality, if you read. You read your maternity mortality in India and the death and the complication, you will not have kids. No chance if rationality is the only terms by which, and you will go to every maternity ward to check and clear. So that's you are working through a different, there is a different paradigm and cosmology by which we live. And the rational structure by which you are scaring yourself out the outside is not the way you live. There is some problem in the thinking procedure. You're making a mistake in the thought.
My question was that I think in the National Museum, I think there is a course for conservation. So if they are running a course for conservation, so if they're running a course on conservation, I mean, aren't they supposed to first train their own staff about it? And my second question is that if Naman had curated that show and they did not care to continue his presence in Delhi, isn't it ethically wrong? Can't the curator question?
Both your questions are answering themselves.
Yeah.
You can.
Okay, sure. Hi. I was going to take a question from Sharjah. No, we're going to continue responses. Do you want?
Yeah, I mean, somehow on behalf of museums or public institutions in general, I think that we are immersed in a larger crisis, and what we are discussing here are mere symptoms, you know, because this is the crisis of the democratic state. And it is not by coincidence that the 1970s, from the nowadays point of view, seem to be some kind of paradise that, you know, it never was. But, you know, the vision of the founding mothers and fathers of those institutions is no longer to be sustained by these officials who are appointed currently, because it's in nobody's interest to appoint the right people to these positions, because the public institutions have absolutely no relevance for those in power, because those in power are perfect product of global neoliberal economy, and their idea is to make profit. And their understanding of progress, it's a progress of a kind of, you know, a cubicle for well-off, relatively well-off family, and not affordable housing for everybody as a vision, right? So I think that these issues, you know, when we address them, we are at the same time addressing a kind of major political issue which is on a global scale, because very similar examples can be, demonstrated in countries that, different of us know from their own experience, like Turkey, Poland, or any country practically, where this sphere in which the state is supposed to, to provide some kind of institutional frameworks in which the public discourse can take place, and public discourse involves controversy, conflict, debate, and so forth. It's in nobody's interest to create such spaces and sustain them. So museums are supposed to be kept in this sort of dormant state, in a state of inertia, inability to act, right? And whether or not there is ways to improve the work of carpenters, it doesn't change the overall picture, because the driving vision is not there anymore, I'm afraid.
I'd like to speak about language.
Can we, sorry, can I just take one more question, and then we can kind of, yeah.
This is a question from Murtaza. In the beginning, there was a mention about the idea of the curator being someone who cares for a collection. Can anyone reflect on their current practices and how it relates to care?
There's a Samoan critic and curator who I'm working with, Lana Lopesi, who talks about artist development. And together with Samoan language experts, we've kind of come up with the term tautuananga o fa'alinga, which is like the service of the display that is centered in the community, rather than, like, curator comes from curare in Latin, to care for, right? But if your collection is also oratory or a repertoire of dance phrases or these kinds of things, it's not only the archiving into a Western necessarily repository of some kind. There's also, like, how do we maintain these things and heart and these other kinds of things. So we, Lana and I and a few others, are working on a project called The Commute, which opens in September in Brisbane. And we kind of decided that we only ever want to work one curator to one or two artists now. And whatever budget we were able to get together, it's like, do you need to pay rent? Who's having an operation in your family? This kind of making our relationships closer and closer. And maybe sometime later we'll have an exhibition of some outcomes of some kind. It's idealistic, but it's also like, otherwise I don't want to do this anymore. 20, 100 artists in an exhibition is kind of ridiculous.
I agree.
Like, if I'm exhausted from attending the Asia Pacific Triennial, for example, where every time it's an introduction to all of these extremely divergent and distinct histories and practices and positions, then, and I've grown up around there, then what is, how do we actually care? Maybe the best exhibition is sitting down and doing meditation for 5 hours.
Abandon.
No, there is this word now in abhikshak, which is basically, the funeral pyre, there is someone who cares, who sees through the burning, then he asks for the feast. I think curation should also be seen as someone who can care like that, which is the most difficult care, to let things go and then have a feast. But it's caring. This preserving is not only a form of caring. You have to let things go and then have a feast. And I think that is, as humans, we had that and we learned that and we keep on doing it. But in theory, we want to preserve everything. It just can't preserve.
Sort of add to that as well.
Aviksha.
So
Diriksha?
This is actually when we were doing this exhibition Venice Space, when we were curating the exhibition Venice Space at JKK, Shweta Sarda was translating for us because we had to have the text in English as well as in Hindi. And this word came up, curator. How do you translate curator in Hindi? And so she actually came up with the word abhikshak as a caretaker, as opposed to nirakshak. Nirakshak is the supervisor. The nirikshak the supervisor,
Direction,
as opposed to the abhikshak, the caretaker. So I think in that, and then we also found ourselves staying there for, almost 25 days, being on the site, working very closely with the practice of, putting things up. And so in some ways, we found ourselves as caretakers in that place. So I think it was a beautiful kind of, translation between the supervisor and the caretaker, I think. Just to kind of point that out.
I just wanted to answer because there's questions. There's a question from Sanchayan, and then there was also another question that was really also sort of thinking through these tasks that have to do with having the knowledge, also having the practical sort of knowledge that extends to what this kind of installing actually means. What does it mean to install? What does it mean? What does it mean for us as curators to kind of undertake that task and role? And I just wanted to sort of share that I do believe that we need to not only sort of sit in classrooms and conference rooms and sort of write our curatorial texts with like 1,000 footnotes, but also to actually undertake this dismantling and reassembling as far as possible. Really take charge of that in different spaces. Now, I sort of would say that when we first had this chance to do an exhibition as students, which was really the moment that I decided that maybe I want to be a curator, sort of maybe I want to do this, which was essentially to sort of meet artists and decide to build a relationship with that artist, but then to not become overly attached to that artist as, a personality, but then throw ourselves into the field of exhibition making. And I remember trying to sort of install Subodh Gupta's chimta work, with the tongs. And it was only when installing that work and putting each one into this kind of grid that I realized what it took to actually make that work. And I remember doing the same sort of with Shilpa's work, Blame. And it was only through sort of the placement of every bottle that the work started to come alive in a completely different way, which did not happen when writing the curatorial text. Now I'd like to share a different example, because I'm working with contemporary art, and I'm not going to pretend to sort of be taking care of 15th century textiles or manuscripts, because I don't have the chance to do that. But when dealing with contemporary art in a European context, in public institutions where the work is insured and the people who handle the work are insured, the curator is, and especially an independent curator, you sort of have to really stand few feet away, okay, and that's very, very alienating. I find that a very difficult thing, and every time, I do try, to sort of touch and move things around. You're really not supposed to, okay, and that is very difficult, and that is where Adam, as artistic director, has no power. Like, he has to also stand away, because this is where him or like the assistant, everybody is in that position. But it is artists who are hired as art handlers. Also, this I just want to share that artists basically also are, of course, they're paid well. The terms of labor and payment are very different from our context, but you really see constantly that art students are taking up this role of installing exhibitions, and it is constantly informing the practice. And for me, at least, because there's this horrible feeling of not being able to touch the artwork that you've commissioned or you've been like thinking about for a year or more. The relationship with the art handler is something that is very, very crucial. And every time, I actually learn more through the conversations with the art handlers. So I just want to sort of share that. I just, because this is a very basic thing, but I wanted to say it. Maybe it helps somebody, I don't know.
Can I add something? I'm sorry, the whole discussion is sort of getting stuck on this, but about curating and care, and what Natasha was just saying also about the curator not being able to touch work because there is a designated professional person who is the art handler in the case of a temporary exhibition, and in a well-functioning museum would be the registrarial staff, so that the curators do the writing and the thinking, but they don't actually physically care for the object. So long ago, when I was fresh out of school and I had an internship in a museum in the US, one of the projects that we had was to travel back to Bihar to an NGO and to buy some textiles which were going to then become part of the collection of the museum, and we were going to do an exhibition. So we go to this village, which is, it's really like a proper village with wattle and dog huts. And there was an NGO where these women were stitching these kantha, figurative kanthas, and spreading the stuff out on the floor for us to see. And we're choosing what we think will go well in the exhibition, packing it, flying back to New York with it. And as soon as we fly back, it's become museum property, and it goes to a museum conservation, a textile conservation person's studio, where she does some sort of chemical treatments to get rid of whatever insect, eggs and all there might be in the textile. And that treatment, of course, costs about 8 times what the textile cost, right? And immediately, as a museum object, this gets transformed into something, that I might have actually worn one of them on the way, but once it's reached the museum, I can't touch it anymore, right? Now, these kinds of protocols that are there, which actually we also aspire towards, that an object should be treated like this, that the surface that it touches should be a stable surface that doesn't have any, is not emitting any fumes, also does something in that it turns museums, curation, the proper handling of art objects into a rich person or a rich country's game. And we also have to think about that. What is curation in spaces of poverty? Is it possible at all? Or are we going to adhere to sort of uniform standards all over the world, consider it progress when we can meet them, and not think about the costs, not just the financial costs, but all the other kind of cultural costs that come with adhering to uniform protocols?
Okay,
sorry, Adam.
Just wanted to add to it. Maybe it's not only a matter of cost, but it's also a matter of function of art and art making. Because these objects, let's imagine an object which is 1,500 years old. This object is now in a museum. The history of this museum in comparison to the age of this object is relatively small history, and I would say that museums should rather make sure that they don't destroy these objects while they are, taking care of them, because somehow, what we call today the art handlers obviously have been handling these objects for 1,500 years, and not much happened to them unless there was a fire or flood or whatsoever. So I think people naturally would know how to handle beautiful and precious and meaningful things. And I don't see a reason why there should be universal protocols established all over the world for handling that effectively detaches both the viewer and a person who wants to know about the object from the object or from the text, because we're talking about manuscripts as we are talking about objects, but it's also texts. And this is something that I was very moved by when I happened to visit a place where archiving, cataloging and digitalizing of the so-called Timbuktu manuscripts was taking place in Bamako in Mali, where in a small 2-story building somewhere in the outskirts, absolutely impossible to find, deliberately not without any sign, what is going on inside. So these manuscripts that were saved from Timbuktu and brought, animals brought them in metal boxes from Timbuktu to save them from destruction, to save them from being burned, basically. And a strange process was happening inside of this building, because each of the manuscript was copied by hand by a professional copyist who was for that purpose handling the manuscript by hand, which I think is a proper way to handle things, I suppose. And after this sort of copying process, where a facsimile copy would be made of a manuscript that might be, for instance, 500 years old, it could be like poetry or philosophy treatise, or it could be like some sort of scientific text. the manuscript would be then put on a kind of reproduction table and photographed digitally, and each manuscript will be then turned into a digital file. And then I saw that the sort of fact sheet or catalog sheet for these digital files was provided by some American university, and that kind of made my curiosity about it awake, because obviously the process was sort of aided by a structure that did not belong to the country of Mali, but it was kind of a technology of knowledge coming from elsewhere, and potentially also allowing, despite the fact that the manuscripts for a time being physically stay in Mali, but they are already, you know, in high resolution digital files available for wider circulation. And just this whole situation produced a lot of questions. I don't have any answers about it, but I think this whole work of preservation and dissemination is not neutral to the object itself and to the knowledge that is somehow contained, I believe, in this very object. And the knowledge that is in a way not transferable, it's not immediately reproducible.
I think that also answers this this question of the kind of threshold inside and outside of institutions. Like, it's really not a fine line. It's the lines in this case are blurred too, and there are, I think also as independent curators, I mean, I'm just speaking for myself, but I also with some colleagues like Obul, I know that we basically are also sustaining our labor through working within sort of more, let's just say, sort of formal institutions that can provide certain conditions, just so that we can also continue the kind of work that pays very little or is really done out of passion or for supporting a kind of, to support colleagues and work that we believe in. And so I don't want to talk about this as some kind of sacrifice or anything. It's just strategy, and I think we all do this. And so just to sort of share that as well as just a practical tip, like sort of to not obviously succumb to institutional pressure, but at the same time to know that if there is this much time that we have to do this work, then how can we work at different scales of institutionality and instituting, basically. There's still more questions. We're actually completely out of time. Is it okay if we actually, sorry, there's a lot of, it's just, there's basically, we're going to sit, should we?
Yeah, we take questions.
That's one possibility.
Let's hear all the questions, but then answer maybe one-on-one.
But also, one way I have an idea is to hear the questions, and then, I mean, maybe if you all don't mind, to just be here for a while. And the and
the concern is the other place,
and then there's right, okay, so I guess we're sharing questions for 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Can I?
Okay.
Their institution, they should get used to.
Okay, 2 minutes.
Practice.
2 minutes.
Practice starting.
Okay.
Should I?
Quickly.
So, mic there, please.
Okay, so I have, I don't have a question. But I will,
But he has.
but yeah, I'm just going to go back to the Kavita moment. Just to say that probably the carpenter who was working was actually, no, it's an important thing. The carpenter who was working in National Museum was probably not a permanent staff. But there are a lot of staff in National Museum and in the ASI who are casual laborers. Okay. And their casual labor, I mean, in my ethnographic experience, I spend time with casual laborers who have been working in ASI for 25 years.
Oh, okay.
And they're casual. And just going back to the Dancing Girl moment, at Harappa, Dancing Girl was found in Mohenjo-daro. 4 years of excavation, 2,000 laborers working, all of them were casual. So probably the moment, and this is what I've seen in almost all archaeological sites, the first person to engage with an artifact is actually a Dalit or an Adivasi or a low caste, casual, working, landless laborer.
Yes.
So that 90% of workforce is that. What's the big? In India, we always had 90% workforce as so-called casual.
Questions and
comments?
comments.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, I can't speak.
So I work at a...
Switch talk.
Hello? Is it audible? Okay. Hi. So this is directed towards Kavita. I work at a museum in Bombay. So I'm just curious as to, since you've been working with, like, you've been talking about museums, writing about them for the past 15 years, teaching students. So how many of your students are actually working in museums? Like, just curious to know.
She can't answer.
Hi. So, I mean, I feel like I'm going to hear a collective sigh when I say the word carpenter again. But just because it's a useful allegory, I think, to just talk about labor, which is often really never spoken about, particularly in contemporary art as well, where a lot of artists are using laborers to make their work. I think using the carpenter as in a totally allegorical fashion, not specifically about this one person, but this is a forced class and caste labor that for generations has not been allowed social mobility outside of that. So to make demands of professionalism from a labor class that has never been allowed to slip outside of that, I think that's where things get tricky, and the onus has to be flipped over to the institution. And I think in order to like make those claims of professionalism, we can't have abstract conversations about education and this and that, because the carpenter himself is coming from an ancient history of carpentry, which is a primarily oral history that is being passed on between generations, and again, allegorical, not the particular carpenter. So maybe in some senses, the carpenter's own trade is just as ancient as the script or fabric that he is holding.
I think Mario had a question.
I was just adding.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm just adding to this actually. The thing is that another gap here with why that happened is that there is no detailing by the exhibition designer. If the exhibition designer details it or speaks with the carpenter how it's possible to install it, because I know the exhibition designer you talk about. So it's, I mean, there's no exhibition designer, so why are we blaming someone else? We should, you know.
So funny. It's so amazing.
Yes, just throw it.
Thank you. It's on. 1-1. Kavita, this is not for you. I'm not coming back to the carpenter. I want to start with I've been obsessed with yogi tea lately, and they have these wonderful wishes on labels. So this is the one I just opened. Create the sequence of goodness. Consequences will always be good. And I just want to think about generative spaces, and I just kind of want to maybe give a little bit of artist perspective. I really enjoyed working on Liverpool Biennial right now. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a self-promotion, but they just left me alone for a year. Kitty and Sally, they were amazing. I just sort of went on thinking and turmoiling, and there were kind of just a few questions that sort of made me think and made me kind of realize the form of the work. And so there's a point to this, why I'm bringing back the artistic perspective. So my question to all the curators or whoever want to answer is that, what are sort of the dream exhibition formats you're most excited about? Is it like 5-hour meditation? Is it like 10 curators, 1 artist? What are your dreams, basically?
Can I just go? Yeah, I mean, I had a very specific question. It was for Erin, actually, was to basically thinking about like regional artistries, was to also, I mean, Cambodia is a very specific case altogether. For something that was so widely photographed as an exotic tourist destination, just when the country goes into like the transitional freedom period, everything that was trying to turn into a photographic national archive just suddenly gets destroyed, and very little of it exists. As a form of recuperation, what happens then is photography, and later on performative photography, that kind of like becomes an aesthetic. I was wondering if I wanted to ask you to respond to the aesthetic of frugality, which I think is super problematic and must be problematized, but at the same time, how little regional artistries do to kind of acknowledge the lack of infrastructure, the lack of economic agency for artists to not have access to material practices, and thereby to rely on practices that actually don't cost any money. And how little do we do to kind of incorporate this within the larger power structure that artistry enables within the global narrative is also, I think, somewhere that one must acknowledge and kind of like, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for all of those questions. So this is, again, not at all to sort of, there's just basically no space to currently sort of go one-into-one and kind of really go into answers per se. But as I said, like, really there will be, everybody will sort of be floating around. So if you all can manage a sort of one-on-one conversation, that would be really appreciated among the different events, personal events, etc., institutional visit that is going to take place shortly. I'm also going to try and use this as a way to wrap up. It's always very, very difficult to wrap up this 3-day gathering. And so in a sense, to have questions in the room is also a way, and I hope that certain discussions can continue, even if there are, as I said, sort of disagreements, you know, different divergent opinions, throwing questions of labor, which of course, as Adam sort of also mentioned, you know, there aren't universal protocols that we need to follow, and part of our responsibility, since that was brought in, is to find our way of negotiation and navigation to avoid those regimes of universalizing protocols, to do this sort of self-learning exercises. And I was quite serious to sort of suggest that young artists really should get involved in the act of exhibition making. And this could change scenarios, and this would overturn the sort of very sharp divisions that we have here between certain kinds of labor coming from certain community groups, right? So this was something that was also discussed in a sense. Dream projects, which is a wonderful thought. You know, I think we should all sort of keep that in mind. But I genuinely also feel that the act of curating, if you take it as more than a paycheck, which usually is the case, not always at all, but somehow I tend to believe that the curators we've invited year after year are doing this for certain selfish reasons, which are in fact about dreaming that dream and about finding possibilities to actually undertake this task and to create just sort of formats and to build communities, as I was suggesting, that are not sort of this utopian when I get a chance, but to also pick up whenever possible that thing that sort of ticks in your head and feels like it makes your head burn. So I hope that that can happen and is happening enough and will more through this format as well. I was also just in the break met somebody who mentioned wanting to apply to JNU at the School of Arts and Aesthetics to study curating, and I do feel that there are different generations in this room, and this is also a space where we can really take this question of, you know, the sort of what it means to translate our knowledge and our experience, not in a heroic fashion, but also I think we have succeeded in acknowledging some of the failures as well, some of the kind of personal failures and pursuits that we continue with. So I hope some of you will return for the next edition. Thank you very much also for those in Sharjah. Thank you to Shumon Bazar and Bonaventure So Bejeng Nikung who joined us. Thank you.
I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for people who are listening to us still on the live feed, to all our partners, Sharjah Art Foundation, Australia Council for the Art, the Goethe Institute, the Park Hotel, to hosting all the curators,
and Take Magazine. But beyond thanking everybody who's a parent within the space, what you see, a whole machinery of people who make the hub what the hub is the hub here, and the physicality of this intimate gathering is for us an opportunity, a privilege, a textural feel of having you over every year. And I hope to, I mean, both Priyanka and I hope to continue to do this for as long as we can. And I would also like to thank our experimenter team again for helping us make this come alive, and to all of you for making this come alive too. Thank you.
I only have boring announcements. Those of you who would like to go to KCC, there are 2 buses. Those of you who would like to go to Experimenter, Baliganj Place, that, people will be able to guide you. But I think those of you who want to make it to KCC should leave now. It's a 20-minute ride from here. Thank you, and good night, and see you soon. Our next exhibition opens on 18th August in both the spaces together.
Are you gonna